The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Pacific waters like a blade through silk, its massive nuclear-powered hull displacing thousands of tons of ocean as it made its way back to Naval Base Kitsap. Seaman recruit Tyler Jennings stood on the hangar deck, his crisp new uniform still stiff with that fresh-from-the-package feel, watching the other sailors move around him with the practiced efficiency of people who actually knew what they were doing. He'd been on the carrier for exactly 3 weeks and already thought he'd figured out how things worked. The hierarchy was simple enough, the routines predictable, and Tyler had always been the type who learned fast and moved faster. Back in basic training at Great Lakes, his instructors had called him sharp. Now he carried that assessment like a badge, chin up, shoulders back, ready to prove he belonged among the 5,000 souls aboard this floating city. The other recruits in his division whispered that he was cocky, that he asked too many questions, that he challenged the petty officers more than was smart for someone so new. Tyler didn't care. He'd joined the Navy to make something of himself, not to spend years mopping decks and painting bulkheads before anyone took him seriously. As he walked through the hangar bay, past the FA-18 Super Hornets chained to the deck, he noticed an old man in faded blue coveralls pushing a mop bucket near the maintenance offices. The guy had to be 70 if he was a day, silver hair cropped military short, shoulders stooped with age and what looked like decades of hard work. Tyler wondered briefly what the old man's story was, probably some civilian contractor brought on to handle the grunt work nobody else wanted to do. The carrier was full of people like that, invisible workers who kept the massive machine running while the real sailors did the important work. Tyler's thoughts were interrupted by Senior Chief Peterson's voice cutting across the hangar deck. The senior chief was built like a fire hydrant, all compact muscle and contained energy, and when he called your name you moved. Tyler jogged over to where Peterson stood with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd just bitten into something sour. The senior chief looked Tyler up and down with the kind of assessment that made recruits squirm, then shoved the clipboard toward him. There was a work detail that needed handling, something about inventory in the forward supply rooms, and Peterson made it clear this wasn't a request. Tyler took the clipboard and nodded, already planning how he'd complete the task in half the expected time to prove his efficiency. As he turned to leave, he nearly collided with the old janitor, who'd moved his mop bucket into Tyler's path. The recruit stepped around him without a word, not noticing the way the old man's eyes followed him across the deck, sharp and measuring despite the weathered face. Tyler had no way of knowing that this chance encounter had been noted, filed away in a mind that had spent 40 years reading young sailors and finding them wanting. The carrier's engines thrummed beneath his feet, a constant vibration that had become part of the background noise of his new life, and Tyler headed toward the supply rooms with the confidence of someone who believed the Navy would bend to his will if he just pushed hard enough. The incident that would change everything started in the communications center 3 days later. Tyler had been assigned to work under Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who ran the radio room with the precision of a Swiss watch and the temperament of a drill sergeant. Rodriguez had a system, a carefully orchestrated routine, that kept the carrier's communications flowing smoothly across dozens of frequencies and channels, coordinating with the rest of the strike group and maintaining contact with shore stations thousands of miles away. Tyler watched this system for exactly 2 hours before deciding he could improve it. The problem, as Tyler saw it, was that Rodriguez was still using some protocols that dated back to before the digital age, insisting on manual checks and redundant verifications that seemed to Tyler like pure bureaucratic waste. He'd studied communication systems extensively during his technical training, had actually scored in the top 10% of his class, and he knew there were faster ways to handle traffic coordination. So when Rodriguez stepped out for a head call, Tyler took it upon himself to reconfigure some of the frequency allocations, streamlining what he saw as an unnecessarily complicated setup. He was still making adjustments when Rodriguez returned, took one look at the equipment, and his face went through several interesting shades of red before settling on something close to purple. The explosion that followed could probably be heard 3 decks down. Rodriguez didn't just yell, he projected, his voice filling the communications center with the kind of fury that made the bulkheads seem to vibrate in sympathy. Tyler tried to explain his reasoning, to walk through the logic of his improvements, but Rodriguez wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in a seaman recruit who just violated about 15 different regulations by making unauthorized modifications to critical communications equipment without permission, supervision, or apparently any functioning brain cells whatsoever. Within 20 minutes, Tyler found himself standing at attention in front of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the communications officer, who listened to Rodriguez's account with the expression of someone watching a slow-motion train wreck. Tyler attempted to defend his actions, explaining that he'd only been trying to increase efficiency, that the modifications he'd made were technically sound, even if procedurally irregular. Chen let him talk for about 30 seconds before holding up one hand in a gesture that made Tyler's mouth snap shut like a trap. She explained, in the patient tone of someone addressing a particularly slow child, that there were reasons for every redundancy in their communication protocols, that these systems had been refined over decades of operational experience, and that a 3-week recruit who thought he knew better than the entire naval communications establishment was demonstrating not brilliance but dangerous arrogance. The punishment was immediate and comprehensive. Tyler was removed from the communications center, assigned to working parties for the next month, and given a formal counseling session that would go into his service record. As he left Chen's office, cheeks burning with humiliation and anger, he almost bumped into that same old janitor again, the guy with the silver hair who seemed to be everywhere on the ship. The old man was wiping down a bulkhead nearby, and Tyler could have sworn he saw something like amusement in those weathered eyes, a knowing look that said he'd seen 1,000 young hotshots come through, and watched most of them crash and burn. Tyler stalked away, his mind already spinning with resentment, convinced that the Navy was too stuck in its ways to recognize real talent when it showed up. The working parties were designed to be humbling, and they succeeded. Tyler found himself waking at 043 every morning to report to the supply deck, where Chief Warrant Officer Burke ran operations with the efficiency of a logistics computer and the warmth of a refrigerator. Burke was a 30-year man who'd worked his way up from seaman to warrant officer through sheer competence and stubborn persistence, and he had exactly zero patience for recruits who thought they were special. The work was brutally simple, moving supplies from one part of the carrier to another, loading and unloading equipment, inventorying endless pallets of parts and provisions. It was the kind of labor that made your back scream and your hands blister, the kind of work that Tyler had assumed was beneath someone with his technical aptitude. For the first week, Tyler seethed with resentment, convinced this was punishment for being right instead of obedient, that he was being hazed by an institution too hidebound to recognize innovation. He worked with mechanical efficiency, doing exactly what was required and not one bit more, his face set in an expression of barely concealed contempt. The other sailors in the working party mostly ignored him, recognizing the attitude of someone who thought he was better than everyone else and would eventually either learn better or wash out. Burke watched Tyler with the calm assessment of someone who'd seen this exact pattern play out dozens of times before, saying nothing but missing nothing. On the 8th day, something changed. Tyler was helping move a particularly heavy piece of equipment, some kind of radar component that weighed close to 300 pounds and had to be maneuvered through a narrow hatchway. When he lost his grip, the component started to fall, and if it had hit the deck it would have shattered into 1,000 pieces of extremely expensive wreckage. Tyler lunged for it reflexively, managing to get his shoulder under one corner, and suddenly there was someone else there, another pair of hands catching the other side. Together they wrestled the component back under control and eased it safely to the deck. Tyler looked up to thank whoever had saved his ass, and found himself staring into the weathered face of that old janitor, the silver-haired civilian who seemed to haunt the carrier's passages. The old man straightened up with a grunt, one hand going to his lower back, and for a moment Tyler saw past the coveralls and the mop bucket to something else, something in the way the man carried himself that spoke of old authority and hard-won competence. Before Tyler could say anything, the old man nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the maze of passageways with the ease of someone who knew the carrier better than his own home. That afternoon, Burke called Tyler aside and told him something that shifted his perspective just slightly. The chief explained that every piece of equipment on the carrier, every system and protocol, existed because someone had died or nearly died when it wasn't there. The redundancies Tyler had mocked weren't bureaucratic waste, they were lessons written in blood and salt water. Burke didn't lecture or condemn, he just stated facts in his flat Michigan accent, and something about the directness of it got through Tyler's defenses in a way that all the yelling hadn't. Tyler went back to work with a slightly different attitude, not exactly humble, but maybe beginning to understand that his 3 weeks of experience might not trump the collective wisdom of generations of sailors. The storm hit on a Tuesday afternoon. rolling out of the northwest with the kind of meteorological fury that reminded everyone exactly how small a carrier really was when nature decided to flex. The Pacific had been calm for weeks, almost Mediterranean in its placidity, and Tyler had started to think all the stories about the ocean's violence were exaggerated. He learned better when the first serious swells started hitting, waves 30 feet high that made the Abraham Lincoln pitch like a carnival ride. The captain ordered all hands to secure equipment and batten down for heavy weather, and suddenly Tyler found himself part of a coordinated chaos that made his communications modifications look like child's play. Everything that could move needed to be tied down, every piece of equipment secured, every hatch sealed against the water that would soon be washing across the flight deck. Tyler worked alongside sailors who'd been doing this for years, following their lead as they moved through the carrier with practiced urgency. The storm intensified throughout the afternoon, the wind howling across the superstructure with a sound like screaming ghosts, the waves growing larger until they were crashing over the bow and turning the flight deck into a waterfall. Tyler had never experienced anything like it, the sheer power of the ocean making itself known through every shuddering impact, every deep groan of stressed metal. He was helping secure equipment near the stern when a particularly massive wave hit, the carrier tilting at an angle that made his stomach drop, and he lost his footing on the wet deck. He went down hard, sliding toward the edge where the safety nets were all that stood between him and a 100-foot drop into churning water. His hands scrabbled for purchase on the slick metal, finding nothing, and for a moment pure animal terror flooded through him as he understood with perfect clarity that he was about to die. Then something caught his arm, a grip like steel clamping onto his wrist, and he was being hauled backward away from the edge. Tyler looked up through rain-blurred vision and saw the old janitor, the silver-haired man who should have been safely inside but was instead out on deck in the storm, his coveralls soaked through and his face set in an expression of intense concentration. The old man dragged Tyler back to solid footing, then shouted something that was lost in the wind before pointing toward a nearby hatch. Tyler stumbled toward it, the old man right behind him, and they both tumbled through into the relative safety of the interior passages. Tyler sat on the deck, his heart hammering, adrenaline still flooding his system, while the old man calmly stripped off his soaked jacket and hung it on a hook like this was just another Tuesday. Tyler tried to thank him, to express his gratitude for saving his life, but the old man just waved him off with a gesture that said it wasn't worth discussing. Still, Tyler noticed something he hadn't seen before, the way other passing sailors nodded to the old man with a respect that went beyond simple courtesy, the way a passing lieutenant actually stepped aside to let him pass. Whoever this janitor was, he wasn't just some anonymous civilian contractor. The storm continued through the night, the carrier riding it out with the patient endurance of a floating fortress, and Tyler lay in his rack listening to the ocean try to tear the ship apart, thinking about how close he'd come to being washed overboard and how a 70-year-old janitor had been the one to pull him back from the edge. When the Abraham Lincoln finally made port at Kitsap 2 days later, Tyler was scheduled for shore leave and planning to spend it as far from the carrier as possible. The storm had shaken something loose in him, a recognition of his own mortality that made the ship feel claustrophobic despite its massive size. He'd received word that morning that his request for reassignment had been denied, that he was stuck in the working parties for another 3 weeks, and the news had rekindled his resentment into full flame. Tyler decided to spend his afternoon at the communications center near the dock, a shore facility that handled coordination with incoming and outgoing vessels. It wasn't official business, but Tyler had convinced himself that if he could demonstrate his skills in a setting away from Rodriguez's watchful eye, maybe someone would notice and get him out of his current assignment. He showed up at the facility without authorization, talked his way past a distracted petty officer at the desk, and was examining the radio equipment when a shore patrol officer walked in and demanded to know what he was doing there. Tyler tried to explain, but his explanation sounded exactly like what it was, a seaman recruit accessing a restricted facility without permission or legitimate purpose. The shore patrol officer was not impressed. Within minutes, Tyler found himself outside being formally challenged, his identification checked, his movements questioned. A small crowd started to gather, other sailors drawn by the spectacle of someone getting hemmed up by the shore patrol. Tyler's face burned with humiliation as the officer called in his status, and he became aware that this incident was going to make his record look even worse than it already did. He was trying to formulate some explanation that didn't sound completely idiotic when a voice cut through the confrontation, calm and authoritative in a way that made everyone stop talking. Tyler turned and saw the old janitor approaching across the dock, still in those faded blue coveralls, still looking like someone's grandfather who'd wandered away from retirement. The shore patrol officer started to wave him off, but the old man said something quietly, too low for Tyler to hear, and the officer's entire demeanor changed. He stepped back, suddenly uncertain, while the old man moved closer to examine Tyler with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. The old man asked Tyler what he was doing at the communications facility, and Tyler, caught off guard by the direct question, told the truth about wanting to prove his skills and get out of the working parties. The old man listened without expression, then asked Tyler if he knew what call sign the Abraham Lincoln used for tactical communications. Tyler rattled off the current designation, Alpha Lima 77, proud to demonstrate at least some knowledge. The old man shook his head slowly and said that wasn't the question he'd asked. He wanted to know if Tyler knew the historical call signs, the ones used during the carrier's major operations over its decades of service. Tyler admitted he didn't, that he'd never thought to look up that kind of historical detail, and the old man made a sound that might have been amusement or disappointment. He turned to the shore patrol officer and said something that made the officer nod and step back, effectively ending the confrontation. Then the old man looked at Tyler and told him to report to Admiral's Row at 6:00 the next morning, gave him a building number and office designation, and walked away before Tyler could ask what the hell Admiral's Row was, or why he was being summoned there. Tyler showed up at the designated building at 0545, early enough to demonstrate he took the summons seriously, even if he didn't understand it. Admiral's Row turned out to be exactly what it sounded like, a cluster of administrative buildings where the senior brass kept their offices, each one a monument to naval hierarchy and institutional power. The building Tyler had been directed to was 3 stories of traditional naval architecture, all sharp angles and no-nonsense functionality. He made his way to the 3rd floor, found the office number he'd been given, and knocked on a door that had a nameplate reading Rear Admiral Retta Marcus Sullivan, Naval Liaison. A voice called for him to enter, and Tyler walked into an office that looked like a museum of naval aviation. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, showing carrier operations from what looked like Vietnam through Desert Storm and beyond. There were pictures of F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats, shots of carrier decks at sunset, and launch operations in rough seas. Behind the desk sat a man Tyler recognized instantly, the silver-haired janitor who'd been following him around the Abraham Lincoln for the past month, except he wasn't wearing coveralls now. He was in full dress uniform, the blue jacket decorated with ribbons and medals that represented a career of distinguished service, and on his collar were the 2 silver stars of a rear admiral. Tyler's brain stuttered to a halt, trying to reconcile the mop-pushing old man with the flag officer sitting in front of him, and Admiral Sullivan watched this processing with something that might have been amusement. Sullivan gestured to a chair and Tyler sat, his mind racing through every interaction he'd had with the man he'd dismissed as an invisible civilian contractor. Sullivan let him stew for a moment, then began to talk in that same calm voice Tyler had heard on the dock. He explained that he was technically retired, but still served as a liaison between the fleet and the Naval War College, that he spent time on carriers as part of his advisory role, and that he had a habit of dressing down and moving through the ships anonymously to get a real sense of how things were operating. It let him see things that admirals in uniform never saw, hear conversations that never happened when brass was around, understand the real state of the fleet beyond what appeared in official reports. Tyler sat there feeling every atom of his arrogance crumble into dust, as Sullivan laid out exactly how many times they'd crossed paths, how many of Tyler's interactions the Admiral had witnessed, and how thoroughly Tyler had failed to live up to his potential. Sullivan wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He was disappointed, and that disappointment hung in the air like smoke. He told Tyler about call signs, about the history the recruit had never bothered to learn. The Abraham Lincoln had used dozens of different designations over its career, each one representing a different era, a different mission, a different crew. Sullivan had served on the Lincoln during its first combat deployment, back when the carrier was brand new and its crew was learning how to operate a nuclear supercarrier in hostile waters. His call sign then had been Ironside Actual, and hearing it was like invoking a legend among the older sailors who'd served with him. He'd been a lieutenant then, a young naval aviator who'd flown F-14s off the carrier's deck and led missions into contested airspace. Now Tyler understood why people had shown the janitor so much respect, why a shore patrol officer had backed down with a single quiet word. Sullivan leaned back in his chair and asked Tyler what he thought the Navy was for, what purpose all this hierarchy and protocol served. Tyler started to give some textbook answer about national defense, but Sullivan cut him off with a gesture. He wanted to know what Tyler really thought, not what he'd been taught to say. Tyler sat there struggling to articulate something he'd never really examined, his understanding of the Navy suddenly feeling shallow and incomplete. Finally he admitted that he'd joined for himself, to prove he was smart enough and capable enough to succeed in something that mattered. Sullivan nodded like this was the answer he'd expected, and asked if Tyler knew how many people were required to launch a single aircraft from a carrier deck. Tyler guessed maybe 50, thinking about the flight deck crew and the catapult operators and the air boss coordinating from the tower. Sullivan smiled without humor and said the real number was closer to 5,000, every person on the carrier playing some role in making that launch possible. The pilot was the visible part, the glamorous part, but without the mechanics keeping the aircraft flight ready, without the supply personnel ensuring parts were available, without the cooks keeping the crew fed, and the engineers keeping the reactors running, and the damage control teams ready to fight fires, that aircraft would never leave the deck. The Navy wasn't a collection of individuals proving their worth, it was a machine where every part had to function perfectly, or the whole thing broke down. Sullivan stood and moved to the wall of photographs, pointing out specific images as he talked. He showed Tyler a picture from Desert Storm, FA-18s launching into the night sky, and explained that he'd been the Carrier Air Group commander for that deployment, responsible for coordinating hundreds of missions. He hadn't flown them all himself, had actually spent most of the war in the operations center, but he'd been part of something larger than any individual contribution. He showed Tyler another photo, this one from humanitarian relief operations after a tsunami, the carrier serving as a floating base for rescue helicopters and medical teams. This was the Navy too, using its massive capabilities not for combat but to save lives, and every sailor on that deployment had been part of saving thousands of people who would have died without their help. Sullivan talked about his 40 years of service, the trajectory from cocky young aviator to seasoned commander to flag officer, and how the hardest lesson had been learning that being smart wasn't enough, that talent without humility was worse than useless, that the Navy didn't need lone geniuses, it needed people who could subordinate their egos to the mission and trust that the system existed for good reasons. Tyler listened and felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. Sullivan sat back down and looked at Tyler with an expression that was both stern and oddly compassionate. He said that Tyler reminded him of himself at that age, so convinced of his own brilliance that he'd nearly gotten himself and others killed by ignoring established procedures. Sullivan had been lucky enough to have a mentor who'd knocked sense into him before he did permanent damage, and now he was paying that forward by knocking sense into Tyler. The working parties weren't punishment for being right, they were education for being wrong in the most dangerous way possible. Tyler needed to learn that the Navy's procedures weren't obstacles to overcome but wisdom to absorb, that every protocol existed because someone had paid in blood to learn that lesson. Sullivan asked Tyler if he understood what he was saying, and Tyler nodded, finding that he actually did understand, that the resentment that had been burning in him for weeks had transformed into something closer to shame. Sullivan stood and told Tyler he was being reassigned, effective immediately, not back to communications but to a training detail where he'd be teaching new recruits basic systems. If Tyler could learn to pass on knowledge instead of hoarding it, to build up others instead of elevating himself, then maybe he had a future in the Navy after all. Tyler stood to leave, his head spinning, and Sullivan called him back for one final thing. Sullivan opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder, the kind of official personnel file that contained someone's entire naval career in paper form. He slid it across to Tyler and told him to open it. Tyler did, finding page after page of commendations, fitness reports, and operational records documenting a career that had spanned 4 decades and touched almost every aspect of naval aviation and carrier operations. Near the front was a photograph from 1984, a young lieutenant in a flight suit standing in front of an F-14 Tomcat on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln during its shakedown cruise, and Tyler recognized the Admiral despite the 40 years that separated that photo from the man sitting across from him. Sullivan pointed to the call sign stenciled on the fighter's canopy rail, the personal designation that pilots wore like a badge of honor, and Tyler read it aloud. Ironside, Sullivan explained that call signs were earned, not chosen, given by your squadron mates based on something you'd done or some aspect of your personality, and his had come from his stubborn refusal to back down during training, his iron-willed determination to be the best. It had served him well as a young aviator, but had also nearly ended his career when that same stubbornness made him ignore flight regulations and attempt a landing in weather that was below minimums. He'd made the landing, but had endangered his entire squadron in the process, and his commander had grounded him for a month and made him work maintenance to understand how his decisions affected the people who had to keep the aircraft flying. That month had changed his entire perspective, had transformed him from a talented pilot into a leader who understood that real strength wasn't about proving your own capabilities, but about elevating everyone around you. Sullivan closed the folder and told Tyler that he'd been following his career trajectory with interest because he recognized the pattern, the same arrogant assumption that individual brilliance mattered more than collective competence. The Admiral said he could either learn from Sullivan's mistakes or repeat them, and the choice was entirely his own, but the Navy wouldn't give him unlimited chances to figure it out. Tyler asked why Sullivan had bothered, why a retired Rear Admiral would spend weeks mopping floors and watching some recruit make an ass of himself, and Sullivan's answer was simple: because someone had done it for him 40 years ago, had cared enough to knock the arrogance out of him before it killed him, and that kind of debt could only be repaid by passing the lesson forward. Tyler left the office with a new assignment, a new perspective, and a story he'd never be able to tell without sounding like he was making it up. Over the following months, he threw himself into teaching with the same intensity he'd once reserved for proving his own intelligence, finding that helping others succeed was more satisfying than any individual achievement. He learned the Abraham Lincoln's history, studied every call sign and operation, talked to the old-timers who'd served through the carrier's entire career. He saw Sullivan occasionally, always from a distance, the Admiral moving through the fleet with that same anonymous authority, and each time Tyler felt a surge of gratitude for the lesson that had saved not just his career but possibly his life. 3 years later, when Tyler made petty officer third class ahead of schedule, his commanding officer noted in his evaluation that he showed exceptional promise as a leader and mentor, exactly the kind of sailor the Navy needed. Tyler framed that evaluation and hung it in his quarters, but next to it he placed something else, a photograph he'd found in the carrier's historical archives, showing a young Lieutenant Sullivan standing on the flight deck in 1984, call sign visible on his helmet, representing everything Tyler was trying to become. The Navy was still a machine, still a vast collection of protocols and procedures and hierarchies, but Tyler had learned to see the humanity within the institution, the way each person's contribution mattered, because they were all part of something larger than themselves. Some lessons could only be learned through humility, and sometimes the teacher arrived disguised as an old man with a mop bucket, and the kind of patience that came from having made every mistake you were about to make and lived to tell about it.